The train hissed like a dying snake as it pulled into the station, brakes shrieking against steel. Dust from the prairie clung to every surface, settling on wood, metal, and sweat-slick brows. Rachel Bell sat still in her seat until the train groaned to a stop, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. One rested over her stomach as if she could shield her child from what came next. The conductor shouted something she didn't catch and people began to disembark. Travelers with sun-beaten hats, ranchers returning from cattle sales, women with parasols and tight smiles. Rachel stood, smoothed her second-hand dress and reached for the small leather suitcase beneath her feet. It was cracked at the seams, much like the heart she carried. She stepped down from the train into a dry heat that bit at her cheeks. The town was small, barely more than a single street, lined with saloons, a church, a general store, and a half-painted sheriff's office. Everything else stretched out into endless ochre, the high desert plains, scattered scrub, and hills that shimmered in the sun like broken glass. Rachel adjusted her shawl to conceal her rounded belly. Though it nearly 6 months long, it was nearly impossible. Still she tried. She always tried. Her heart thundered as she scanned the waiting faces. He wasn't hard to spot. Horace Keir stood at the far end of the platform, arms crossed, boots polished, mustache trimmed. He looked like the kind of man who ordered others around and expected never to be questioned. His hat was wide-brimmed, black and spotless, like it had never seen dirt, only power. He held the letter she'd sent clutched in one hand as she approached. His eyes slid from her face to her belly. They froze there. The silence was thick. Rachel offered a gentle smile. "Mr. Keir, I'm Rachel Bell from the correspondence, your PR," he said. The smile faltered. "Yes, I mentioned I was a widow. My fiancé died just before we were to be married. You didn't say you were pregnant." "I thought," she swallowed, "I thought maybe that wouldn't matter. I'm a good cook, I can sew, and I'm healthy. I work hard." I wanted to start again. He stared at her like she'd spat in his coffee. "You didn't say you were damaged." Rachel's mouth opened but no words came. The sun beat down harder than before. All sounds seemed to vanish from a platform. Even the wind held its breath. "I came here," she said finally, her voice cracking, "because I believed your letter. You said you wanted a woman with strong values, a woman of faith, a family." "I didn't mean somebody else's family," he snapped. "I need a proper wife, one who doesn't come with complications." People were turning now, watching. A few travelers paused to see the show. One woman whispered behind a fan. Rachel's ears rang. "I spent all my money getting here," she said. "Please just let me explain." Horace tore the letter in half right in front of her, then dropped it to the ground. "I don't need to hear anything more. You should have stayed back east." He turned and walked away without another word. Rachel stood alone as her suitcase toppled over, its contents spilling into the dust. 2 dresses, a worn Bible, a ribbon meant for the baby's crib. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather everything with shaking hands. The tears didn't come right away. They came slow, hot and humiliating. She forced them down. There were eyes on her, watching, judging. One little boy pointed and asked his mother why the lady was crying. The mother pulled him away like Rachel carried disease. She rose, stuffed the last of her things into the case, and walked down the street with no direction, no plan, just a heartbeat that echoed twice, hers and her child's. Every door she passed was closed. She asked for water at the saloon, was told it ain't for her kind. She tried the general store, but the owner wouldn't meet her eye. By the time the sun was slipping behind the hills, Rachel sat beneath the covered porch of the abandoned stagecoach office, clutching her case like a life raft. Her shoes were scuffed, her throat dry, and her belly heavy. Her baby shifted, and she whispered to it, "I'm so sorry. I thought we were going somewhere good." A wind picked up, dry, cold, hauling. It dragged dust along the street, rattled shutters, and carried with it the sharp tang of distant fire. Her dress whipped around her knees. Then she heard footsteps, boots slow, deliberate. She looked up. The man was tall, over 6 feet, with a broad frame and rough features that spoke of labor and loss. His hat was low over his eyes, his duster long and weather-beaten. A revolver hung at his side, but his hands were empty. He stopped just short of the porch and said nothing. Rachel stood slowly, ready to retreat. He tipped his hat back. His eyes were gray, steady. "You got somewhere to be?" She shook her head, wary. "No." "You got anyone to help you?" Another shake. He nodded toward the edge of town. "I've got a place, nothing fancy, but it's got a stove and a roof that don't leak. You and the baby can rest there if you want." She squinted at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "Ain't right." "What happened?" "That's not your problem. Don't reckon it still ain't right." She stared at him. He didn't leer, didn't glance at her belly. He looked her in the eye, then at the suitcase, and then at the sky. "Storm's coming," he added as if to prove the point. "Thunder rumbled over the hills." Rachel hesitated for another breath before finally nodding. He reached out, not for her but for the suitcase, picked it up like it weighed nothing, then turned, not checking if she followed. She did. The walk was quiet. Town fell away behind them. The man led her along a narrow trail through scrub and juniper trees until they reached a modest cabin tucked at the edge of a dry creek bed. Smoke curled from a chimney inside. It was dim but warm. A fire burned in the hearth left the floor was swept clean. There were 2 chairs, a cot, a table, and a simple kitchen with a stew pot simmering. He placed her suitcase by the cot. Rest, you look like you need it. Rachel finally asked, what's your name? He turned, paused, then said Elias. Elias Hart. She sat on the cot, bone tired and numb. I'm Rachel. I figured. He turned back to the stove and stirred the stew without another word. She watched him in the firelight. His movements were unhurried but not lazy. There was something coiled beneath his cowl, a man who had seen trouble and made peace with it. She laid back and stared at the ceiling. The baby kicked. She placed her hand over the movement, blinking fast. Elias broke the silence again. You're not the first this town's turned on, he said. She said nothing. I ain't going to ask questions you don't want to answer, but you're safe here long as you want to be. She turned her head to look at him. You expect something for this? He looked over, brow furrowed. No, men usually do. I ain't most men. There was nothing more to say after that. She fell asleep to the sound of the fur crackling, stew bubbling, and Elias humming something low and sad, a tune that might have once said words but didn't anymore. Outside, thunder cracked again, louder this time. The storm rolled over the hills and the night swallowed the town hall. In the morning she'd have to decide what came next, but for now she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't made a mistake stepping off that train. Maybe not every man turned away from a woman who came with a little baggage and a lot of heart, and maybe in a town full of locked doors one had opened just wide enough for hope to step through. The cabin smelled of pea sap, smoke, and something rich simmering over the stove. Rachel stood just inside the threshold, fingers still curled around the door frame. Her boots caked with dust left soft prints on the clean wooden floor behind her. The wind clawed at the dark with dry hands, howling like a creature denied warmth, but here inside everything was still. Elias didn't speak. He moved with quiet assurance, labeling stew into 2 tin bowls. The firelight glinted off the curve of his jaw, catching in the stubble and lines etched deep by weather work or both. She hadn't said much since they'd arrived, just nodded when he gestured to the cot and sat stiff backed on its edge. She kept her coat wrapped around her even though the fire gave off generous heat. Her suitcase rested beside her like a nervous dog. He handed her the bowl and a spoon, then sat across from her at the table. No grace was said, no words were offered, just the sound of 2 people eating in silence. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. Elias's presence didn't demand anything. That alone unnerved her more than if he had. Rachel took her first bite and blinked. This is good. Stew's better the longer it cooks. She glanced around. The cabin was small but cared for. Books lined a shelf above the hearth. A rifle hung on 2 hooks near the door. The bed in the far corner was neatly made, a quilt of dark blues and grays, hand stitched. You live here alone? I do. For how long? Couple years. She looked at him directly. You don't talk much, do you? He met her gaze with a shrug. Folks say enough without me adding to it. She couldn't help a slight smile. And here I thought men out west were full of themselves. Summer, he said, but those are usually the ones with something to prove. Rachel didn't ask what he had to prove or what he was hiding, but the curiosity itched at her just beneath her skin. She pushed it aside, focused on eating. Each spoonful brought warmth back to her bones. She hadn't realized how cold she gotten until it began to thaw. When the bowl was empty, she placed it on the small table beside the cot and curled onto her side. Her hand drifted instinctively to her belly. The baby moved again, restless like always when she was near warmth. You can sleep there, Elias said, standing. I'll take the chair. You don't have to. I know. He took the rifle from the wall, checked it without a word, then propped it near the door. His movements were second nature. He wasn't doing it for show, which meant he thought there might be reason to use it. Rachel adjusted the pillow and let her eyes close, but sleep hovered just out of reach. The cabin creaked in the wind. Somewhere far off a coyote howled. Elias sat in the chair beside the fire, staring into the flames. After a time she asked, why? You help me? He didn't answer right away. Because no one else did, he said finally. I don't know if I can trust you. You don't have to. She turned toward him, watching the profile of his face in the firelight. His jaw was tense, not with anger but with restraint, the kind of man who carried things he never said aloud. I was supposed to marry him, she whispered. The father of my child. He died during a robbery at the Moranti shot trying to protect a stranger. Elias didn't look at her, but she knew he was listening. I wrote Horace thinking maybe it was a way to start fresh. I never expected love, just a place, a roof, a chance to raise my child with dignity. And he called you damaged? Yes, Elias nodded slowly. Men like that think dignity's something you earn by being born the right way, wearing the right dress, carrying the right name. Rachel watched him for a long moment. What about you? She asked softly. What did you lose? Elias's eyes flickered toward her for the first time since she'd begun talking. Something raw passed through his gaze, but he looked back to the fire and said nothing that was answer enough. The wind howled again. Rachel closed her eyes and for the first time in months allowed herself to feel tired without guilt. She slept deeper than she expected. When morning came she woke to the smell of coffee and The sound of eggs frying in a pan light poured through the single window, turning the edges of the room gold. She sat up slowly, hand on her belly. The child within was quiet, as if sleeping too. Elias handed her a plate. He looked like he'd been up for hours. I could have cooked, she offered. You needed rest more. You always this decent, just with people who don't deserve worse. Rachel ate slower than last night. The silence between them was different now, familiar. After breakfast, Elias pulled on his coat, going to head into town, grab some supplies. Her heart jolted. You're coming back? He turned. You want me to? She didn't answer, but something in her chest loosened. Elias nodded. I'll be back by sundown. Locked the door behind me. As soon as he left, the cabin felt bigger, emptier. She wandered through it slowly, taking in every detail. A photograph tucked in a drawer, too worn to see clearly, but she could make out a woman and a little boy, his son, his wife. He'd said nothing of family. Later, Rachel swept the floor, washed the dishes, and reorganized the shelves. She worked because it helped her think, because it gave her something to hold on to in a world that kept tilting beneath her feet. By mid-afternoon, clouds gathered, thunder rumbled in the distance. She stepped outside just as the first droplets fell. Elias returned as promised. His coat was soaked and he carried 2 sacks of goods: flour, beans, coffee, and a length of linen. Thought you might want something to sew with, he said, setting it on the table. She looked at the fabric, pale blue, soft for the baby, he added. Her throat tightened. Thank you. He pulled off his coat and hung it by the fire. The storm outside thickened. Rain fell in sheets. The wind rattled the windows. They spent the rest of the day inside, talking in snatches. Rachel learned Elias used to be a ranch hand, that he had left a job back east and never looked back. He never mentioned the photo, and she didn't press. After supper, she sat on the cot, mending a tear in her shawl. He carved something small from a piece of pine, his hand steady, patient. The quiet between them was peaceful. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she'd felt anything close to peace. You can stay here as long as you want, Elias said suddenly. She looked up. I mean it. No pressure, no expectations, just a place to rest, raise your child if that's what you want. Rachel set her sewing down. You don't even know me. I know enough. You know I bring trouble. He gave her a smile. Don't we all? A beat passed. She asked, you ever wonder if folks like us, people the world throws out, maybe we find each other for a reason? Elias didn't smile at that, but he nodded. I think the world's too cruel for accidents. Rachel didn't say anything else. Her hand drifted to her belly again and she whispered something only the child could hear. Outside, the rain slowed. Inside, something had shifted, soft as breath, strong as promise, and though she wouldn't admit it aloud, Rachel Bell, abandoned, rejected, and called damaged, had begun to wonder if she'd stumbled not into another mistake but into something rare, a quiet kind of refuge, the beginning of a life not built on fear or survival but choice. She watched Elias as he carved in the fur light and felt just for a moment safe, but safety in the West never came without a price, and some debts always came due. The townsfolk had always fed on gossip the way wolves did on raw meat, ravenous, messy, and with no care for the bones they left behind. Rachel Bell, once a stranger stepped off a train, had now become the centerpiece of every whispered conversation that clung like smoke in the corners of saloons, the pews of churches, and the porches where idle hands pretended to mend. The story changed each time it was told to some. She was a loose woman who tricked 2 men and fled from justice, to others a devil in a dress, hiding sin behind a soft face. There were a few who simply pitied her, though not enough to speak up, and certainly not enough to stand beside her. Elias knew the moment he walked into town that weak heads turned faster, voices dropped lower. Even Sheriff, a man who rarely bothered with small-town scuttlebutt, pulled Elias aside in front of the post office. You stirring things up, harsh? Sheriff Crane asked, pushing his hat back and squinting at the sky as if the sun might give him an answer. Elias wouldn't. I'm minding my own, Elias said flatly. Horace Kerr's been telling folks you're shacking up with his bride, says you took what's his. She ain't his. That don't matter to the kind of men who follow Horace, the sheriff warned. They're not big on facts, just loud voices and quick tempers. Elias's eyes narrowed, jaw tensing. They come for her. They'll meet me first. I ain't doubt you, Crane muttered, stepping back. Just saying. I've seen good men buried because they fought the wrong kind of stupid. He walked off, but Elias stood a while longer in the street, shoulders drawn tight beneath his coat, eyes hard under the brim of his hat. The town had shifted. He could feel it in the ground, like a storm building below the dirt. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sky was already bruising. Rachel met him at the door, sleeves rolled, hands flow. She had been baking biscuits by the smell of them, and her cheeks were pink with heat and exertion. You were gone longer than usual, she said. He brushed past her, set down the sack of goods, ran into the sheriff, her hands stilled. What did he say? Same thing the wind's been saying for days. Trouble's coming. Rachel exhaled slowly and turned back to the stove, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. Maybe we should leave. No, Elias's answer came too quickly. He softened it with, this place, it's yours now, ours if you want it. I won't let let them chase us off. She didn't respond, but when she served him supper her hands trembled slightly that night as he sat carving a block of cedar into something he hadn't decided the shape of yet. Rachel spoke from the cot. I dreamed last night the cabin was burning. I couldn't find you. I was alone with the baby in the smoke. It was thick, choking. Elias didn't lift his eyes. Dreams are just thoughts that got lost or warnings. He looked up at her, saw the worry swimming behind her voice. She didn't scare easily, but the town, the people, what they could do with enough hatred and too little conscience. That was a different kind of danger. That was fear sharpened into action. He set down the carving and checked the rifle by the door. That night neither of them slept. 2 days later the fire came. It began as a whisper in the dark. Rachel awoke to the scent, acrid, bitter, unmistakable smoke. Her eyes snapped open, heart already racing. In the next instant she heard the crackling outside the window, followed by the soft insidious roar of flames licking wood. Elias, she shouted. He was already at the door, half-dressed, eyes wide and alert. The fire had wrapped itself around the rear of the cabin. Flames leapt from the brush, feeding on the dry summer like it had waited for this moment all season. Back door, he yelled, grabbing the rifle and tossing it over his shoulder. Rachel struggled to her feet, one arm wrapped around her belly. The smoke was thick now, curling through the gaps in the windows, reaching in with hot fingers. Elias grabbed her suitcase and threw open the door. The heat struck like a wave. They ran. Ash rained from the sky. The world was a blur of orange and black, like some wicked oil painting turned to chaos. Rachel coughed violently, her legs nearly giving out. Elias stayed close, hand on her elbow, guiding her away from the inferno that had once been their home. Behind them the cabin groaned, a sound like splintering ribs. Rachel turned just in time to see the roof collapse, sparks exploding into the night sky like fireworks birthed from hell. They made it to the tree line, breathless, lungs scorched, clothes smudged with soot. Elias pulled her down behind boulder and scanned the horizon. Someone did this, Rachel gasped. It wasn't an accident. Elias didn't answer, but his silence was heavier than any confirmation. In his eyes she saw it, rage buried deep under restraint. Whoever had done this had meant for them to die in that fire. Horrors, she breathed. Or one of his, Elias said grimly. Hume's been stirring up the town. Rachel trembled, not from cold but from something deeper. They meant to kill us, you and the baby. Elias corrected quietly. They don't care about me. She gritted her teeth. I care. His eyes flicked to hers, startled by the edge in her voice. They didn't return to the ruins until dawn. The fire had eaten everything, the walls, the cot, the books, the quilt, all gone. Only a few blackened posts stood stubborn and skeletal against the pale sky. Elias sifted through the rubble, retrieving what he could, his revolver half buried and charred, a tin cup, the blade he'd carved with. Rachel picked through the ashes near where the kitchen had been, beneath a pile of scorched wood. Her fingers touched something hard, a rifle. She pulled it free, coughing as S coated her palms. The weapon was old but well cared for. The initials etched into the wood were faint but still like Ibel EH. She turned to Elias, holding it up. His face darkened. You weren't meant to find that. She didn't press, but her mind whirled. Who were you? She asked quietly. Doesn't matter. I think it does. Elias ran a hand down his jaw. I was someone who did things he regrets. That name don't belong to me anymore. And yet, she said, brushing ash from the initials, it's still yours. He looked at her, then really looked, and whatever he saw there made him sigh and sit on one of the burned logs. I rode with a crew once, young and stupid, thought I could carve a name out of a world with grit and a gun. Got people hurt, innocence. I walked away before I became like the worst of them, but the name still follows. Rachel sat beside him, her belly pressing against her knees. I don't care what your name used to be, she said. I care about the man who saved me, who gave me shelter, who didn't ask questions. He glanced at her sideways. Even now she nodded, especially now he stared out at the ruins of the cabin. We can rebuild. She gave a small smile. You're not giving up? Never have. The wind shifted somewhere far off. A hawk cried out across the canyon. They left that day heading into town with so still in their hair and blistered hands wrapped around each other's strength. Elias walked, the rifle slung across his back, Rachel steady beside him, the baby kicking softly beneath her ribs. When they reached the town's edge, every eye turned toward them. The whispers began immediately, but Rachel didn't flinch. She met those stares with her chin high and her eyes bright. Sheriff Crane stepped forward from a boardwalk, eyes roving over the blackened, stood still clinging to them. Jesus, he muttered, they really tried. Elias just nodded. You know who the sheriff asked? Doesn't matter, Elias said. Not yet. Rachel spoke up, voice stronger than ever before. I want a roof over our heads and the names of those who stood watching when Horace stirred the mob. Crane's eyebrows lifted. You want justice? I want peace, she said, but I'm willing to fight for it. He tipped his hat. Then let's start with a place to stay. They moved into a one-room cabin on the edge of town, empty for years but with good bones. Townsfolk watched uncertain, but the tide had shifted. A few dropped off food, someone delivered nails and timber. Not everyone was cruel. At night Elias stood at the edge of the porch watching the horizon. Rachel joined him, belly pressing forward, wrapped in Elias's coat. They Won't stop, will they? She asked. No, he said, but neither will we, and that was the truth. The fire hadn't broken them, it had revealed them, and the next time someone tried to put them down they'd be ready. The wind carried heat that day, dry and sharp like it had been sharpened against the canyon walls before sliding into town. Dust swirled across the wooden planks of the main street, catching in the folds of skirts and the creases of old men's eyes. Something was coming, everyone felt it. Rachel Bell stood outside the newly rebuilt cabin at the edge of town, her belly full and round beneath a faded blue dress. Her hand rested lightly over it, fingers curled as if already protecting the child inside. She watched the trail, heart tugging against her ribs with a mix of dread and resolve. Elias's heart stood beside her, rifle slung over one shoulder, jaw set like stone. He hadn't shaved in days, his eyes were darker than usual, not with fear but with decision, that kind of stare that came from a man who'd seen blood, survived it, and was ready to spill more if need be. They coming, Rachel said. He didn't nod, didn't blink, just waited. A cloud of riders rose over the hill like a bruise on the horizon. 8 men all armed at the center rode Horace Keir, clean shaven and smiling like the devil himself in a white hat. His boots were polished, his coat gleamed, but his eyes were empty. Behind them townsfolk gathered at windows behind curtains and half-cracked doors. The streets emptied, the air changed. Rachel felt it in her blood, so did the baby. A single kick, hard and sudden. You can go inside, Elias said quietly. No, she replied, this is my fight too. He looked at her, there was no arguing. The riders slowed to a trot, then dismounted as one. Horace approached with a calm stroll, hands visible, voice oily. Well, ain't this a picture? Little Miss Bell, standing proud like a queen on a pile of ashes, thought you'd learned your lesson already. Rachel's voice was steady. That you can't burn out a soul that don't fear you. Horace chuckled. You always did have a sharp tongue, bet that got you into trouble plenty back east. Elias shifted beside her one step forward. That's far enough. Horace looked him up and down. You really think you're going to keep her, that baby? You got no name, no land, no law behind you. I got enough. I'm here to take what's mine. Horace said louder now so the town could hear. She was promised. I have letters, contracts, this is legal. Rachel stepped forward. You ripped those letters up in front of a crowd. You lied. I told you I was a widow. You assumed that meant clean and empty. Her voice cracked like lightning. I am not empty, I am not ashamed. And you, Horace Keir, you're a coward hiding behind paper because you can't stand beside a woman who's stronger than you'll ever be. The men behind Horace shifted uneasily. One of them glanced toward the crowd that was beginning to gather, quiet but watching. You can't speak to me like that, Horace barked. Rachel's hand tightened over her stomach. I just did enough, Horace snapped. He turned to Elias. This is your last chance, give her up or I'll take her. Elias exhaled slowly and unslung the rifle from his shoulder. Try. The moment snapped like a dry twig. One of Horace's men drew. Elias moved first. The rifle barked once. The shooter dropped with a scream, clutching his thigh. Another reached for his holster. Elias was already on him. 2 shots rang out quick, clean. One hit the man's shoulder, the second drove the others back. The crowd gasped, but no one ran, no one helped Horace either. Elias advanced. Rachel stood behind him, lips pressed, head, heart pounding. Horace stumbled back. Hands up now, you'll hang for this. No, Elias said low and cold. I won't. Sheriff Crane stepped out from the saloon, rifle in hand, jaw tight. This is done, Horace. He shot my men. They drew first, the sheriff said. And I saw it. Hell, the whole town saw it. Horace paled. His bluster evaporated like water on iron. You can't do this. I ain't doing anything, Crane said. You did it to yourself. The townsfolk were stepping out now, not in fear but in solidarity. Old Mrs. ROR, the butcher and his son, even the school teacher, all of them had watched Rachel humiliated, then nearly killed, then rebuild what was lost. Now they stood with her. You can leave, Ross said, voice unwavering. You can leave and know you lost, or you can try again and find out just how much fight is left in a woman you called ruined. Horace looked at them all, the rifle in Elias's hand, the resolve in Rachel's eyes, the quiet threat in the crowd's presence, and for the first time he looked small. He turned and walked. His men followed, one limping, another cursing. No one helped them. When they were gone, silence returned, then a slow ripple of movement as people returned to their lives, but not before a few of them tipped their hats or muttered quiet thanks. The tide had shifted. Rachel was no longer an outsider. She was someone they respected, maybe even feared a little, and that was fine. Later that evening Rachel sat on the porch, feet up, her hand gently stroking her belly. You think he'll come back, she asked. Elias stood beside her, whittling a small piece of wood into something that resembled a rocking horse. Maybe, he said, but if he does it won't end the same. Rachel looked out at the twilight settling over the hills. I was so scared, Elias, not just of him but of never being seen, never being wanted. You were seen, he said softly, by the wrong people maybe, but I saw you. I still do. She reached out, touched his hand. And I see you too, not the past, not the name you ran from, the man you chose to become. He didn't speak but his fingers tightened around hers. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, a quiet reminder of everything everything still ahead. When the sun dipped below the ridge, a peace settled that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with belonging, real honest belonging. Weeks passed. The child was born on a stormy morning, screaming and red-faced with fists like firecrackers. A girl, strong, healthy, loud. Rachel named her Hope. Elias held her with hands that once knew only weapons and now cradled life. He whispered things no one else heard, things only a father would say. They built more than a home, they built a life, one where her name was no longer spoken with pity or contempt, one where his past no longer cast shadows. And the legend spread, quiet at first, then louder, of the woman who stood her ground, the man with no name who found it again through love, the fire that couldn't consume them, the town that changed because they chose to fight. In a corner of the West where cruelty once reigned, something else took root, a new name, a new family, a new legend. And it all began with a woman no one wanted and a man who finally saw her.